The overriding theme for the new edition of our most popular report, which is our National Top 10 Best Buys report, which we published today, is our favourite catch cry at the moment, which is think small for big growth. Think small for big growth. And what we mean by that is that we think looking forward, taking a medium to long-term view, the focus on where to find the best growth, the best buys, is no longer on our biggest capital cities. It's on some of our smaller capital cities and some of our better regional centres. So think small for big growth. Now, I say that being very mindful that figures out today from CoreLogic and yesterday from SQM Research do show significant improvement price-wise in the markets for Sydney and Melbourne. We're also seeing that reflected in other real estate data like auction clearance rates. But we do take a different view. That's taking a very short-term outlook where those figures look at weekly changes and monthly changes. We're more interested in a more long-term view. And we think that the best growth, the best buys, taking into account affordability, as well as prospects for good capital growth and also good rental returns, all of those factors are part of the choices we make when selecting the locations that feature in a report like National Top 10 Best Buys. And we do think that the best prospects looking forward will come in some of those smaller capital cities and some of the better regional centres. Now, by way of background information, it's interesting to note that in the last week, CoreLogic has published the latest edition of its Pain and Gain report, where it looks at how many of the properties sold in the most recent quarter actually sold for a profit. In other words, it sold for a price higher than what the seller paid when they were the buyer, going back 1 year or 5 years or however long it takes. And that report did find in general terms that looking at house sales in the most recent quarter, 90% of the properties sold in the most recent quarter were sold at a profit for the vendor. But one of the interesting findings of that report, and a relatively unusual one according to CoreLogic, is that the performance of the properties that sold for profit was better in the regional areas than in the capital cities. A greater percentage of properties sold in the regional areas sold at a profit than was the case in the region in the capital cities. So that's just one factor. We're very interested in the regional areas at Hotspotting for a whole host of reasons. We think buying in a good regional area is a win-win-win situation. The first win is a much cheaper buying price than you get in the bigger cities. The second win is much better rental yields. And the third win is if you select well, you buy in the right locations, you're going to get pretty good capital growth. So this new edition of National Top 10 Best Buys does have quite a strong focus on the regional cities and also some of the smaller capital cities. Another piece of information that came to light in the past week was the latest data on population growth, particularly focused on net interstate migration, which charts where Australians are moving to within Australia. Cities like Sydney and Melbourne make big gains from overseas migration, but this looks at which areas are making the biggest gains from interstate migration, people moving from one part of Australia to another. And what that does show is that people are actually leaving New South Wales in large numbers, and there's also still quite a drain, although less than the year before, in Western Australia. These are all reflections of things happening in local economies. The biggest gainers are Victoria and Queensland. Queensland by far is having the biggest gains. That was the case last year. It was number one and Victoria was number two. This year, Queensland again number one and Victoria number two, but the margin between number one and number two is greater than it was last year. So overwhelmingly, Queensland is the state that's gaining the most from net interstate migration. So its population is being boosted by that. And what we know to be true from other research is that approximately 90% of the migration to Queensland goes to southeast Queensland. So there's a bit of a focus on that in the new edition of Top 10 Best Buys report. So one of the locations that features very prominently is the Sunshine Coast, not far from where I'm currently sitting talking to you. And I could perhaps be accused of being a little bit biased because I'm focusing on an area that you could say is my local area. But we research the whole of Australia with what we do with hotspotting, and I believe that the Sunshine Coast is the most compelling economic growth story anywhere in Australia right now. In fact, I've just finished writing a very major report on the Sunshine Coast, that's its subtitle, the most compelling growth story in Australia. Relative to its size, what's happening on the Sunshine Coast is quite a remarkable economic story, massive spending on infrastructure, the creation of new industries, a new CBD being built from the ground up, a $5 billion project, the airport going international, the new international broadband network through a subsea cable coming in from Asia, the new medical precinct, billions of dollars being spent on the motorway that forms the western spine of the Sunshine Coast coastal strip, etc., etc., etc. And that's generating major activity in the property market. There's a lot more to the National Top 10 Best Buys report. There are other regional areas that we focus on. There are other parts of Queensland that also feature in the report. Victoria, the other state that gains majorly from interstate migration, and also in the case of Victoria from overseas migration. It features strongly as well. There's one of the Melbourne locations and a couple of regional locations from regional Victoria also feature strongly in this report. It's quite a broad spectrum. There are locations in Western Australia, locations in South Australia, Queensland, Victoria, and we're looking right across the country for the areas we think have the best prospects, good buy-in prices, good prospects for future growth. And what they all have in common is very vibrant local economies. We strongly believe that real estate markets arise out of local economies. It's very much about the local dynamics. It's much less about national factors like the level of interest rates or tax benefits. It's really about what's going on in the local economy, and these are all places where the local economy is growing, is diversified, is vibrant, creating jobs and good prospects for the future. So I urge you to get yourself a copy of the new edition of the National Top 10 Best Buys report out now, and it very much encapsulates the factors that we think are important for real estate consumers of all sorts to look for if you're looking to buy in areas with growth, and most real estate consumers are. These are the locations we think are most likely to provide it going forward. And they include, as I mentioned, the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Bendigo in Victoria, and the city of Stirling in Perth, as well as Port Adelaide in Adelaide. Just a sample of some of the locations that feature prominently in this report, for which the theme is, as I said at the beginning, think small for big growth. Time for a change in mentality. It's also time for investors to get off the fence, because the evidence suggests that what's driving the upturn in real estate, particularly in the capital cities, but also in some of the stronger regional markets, is primarily home buyers, because the previous upturn, which was largely confined to the biggest cities, was perhaps driven primarily by property investors. But the figures show that property investors are still not a major force in the market. They withdrew and haven't come back in big numbers yet. So the current upturn is driven very much by owner-occupier home buyers and first home buyers. But all the evidence suggests that real estate is really coming back very strongly as a result of a series of fortunate events, as I like to call it, since the middle of May, the election result, the series of interest rate reductions, of which we had the third one today from the Reserve Bank, part of which is being passed on by the major banks, but not all. Easier access to finance through the APRA changes and other measures, the tax cuts, etc. And that's starting to translate into price growth. We saw from the figures out in the last couple of days from two major sources that we're seeing prices grow in the last month, in the last quarter, in many of our major markets and some of our regional markets. And so I think it's time for investors to stop sitting on the fence and get active again, because there's growth to be found out there. All across Australia, there's growth, not in every location, obviously, but it's not just confined anymore to the biggest cities. It's some of the smaller capital cities and some of our better regional markets. So that's it for now. Terry Ryder from hotspotting.com.au signing off. Let's talk again soon.